You know what increases appeal and breathes life into a scene? That's right, animation. And in this chapter, we won't be animating anything, because first we need to tell Blender how and what things to move. And that requires rigging. Now, part of me wishes this part could be fully automated, but there is also an immense amount of satisfaction building and seeing a rig slowly come together. Kind of like grown-up Meccano or Lego Technic. In this chapter, we will be preparing our model for rigging to preempt any deformation or performance issues. We'll then proceed to plan and build out our armature, approximating the center of mass and aligning rotations, all the time using our already made mesh as a guide for bone placement. We'll then move to create a hierarchy of bones to ensure that we have connected everything up in a child-parent relationship and nothing is left behind. And we'll then restrict and automate certain movements with the help of bone constraints. Pushing the automation even further, we'll look at how we can use drivers to, well, drive the various input values to create our animations based on a little bit of maths or math. I don't know about you, but I failed pretty hard at maths, but thankfully there are a lot of resources out there to help us out. And finally, we'll take all of this new visual complexity and organize it away safely, so we're left with a clean rig for animation. And by the end of this chapter, our basic bot will be ready for animation. So let's get going. Hello again, we are back with our beautifully modeled and shaded basic bot. But before we can start rigging, we need to just fix a few geometry issues. Now, this mainly involves applying modifiers that could mess up deformations or performance, but also organizing the main sections of our basic bot into collections in order to easily select them in the following videos. But first thing is first, we want to keep this version of our basic bot in case we need to jump back and do any tweaks, as there is a lot of handy non-destructive modifiers. So in order to do that, let's jump into our outliner. Just select Scene Collection, right click, and click New Collection. And here we can call this one Basic Bot Master. Selecting all of our elements here and dropping it in. Now we can right click that collection and duplicate collection. And then change our duplicated collection from a master suffix to a rigged suffix. And then hide our Basic Bot Master, so we don't accidentally touch anything on it. Now, when setting up a rig, we can actually keep a lot of the modifiers in place, but I have found that sometimes it takes a bit of a performance hit, and we also have to consider the fact that we would need to parent the cutters as well to the various bones and armatures that we're wanting to set up. So I found a nice simple way to keep the performance high and not have to think about that is to apply all our modifiers. But before we do so, we just have to make sure that all of our objects hold their own meshes. As you can see here from the mesh options, sometimes the object, although unique, holds a mesh that is shared. And this will cause issues when applying our modifiers. So in order to set this up, let's first jump into our new Basic Bot rig collection and just hide our hide collection here because we don't want to affect anything there. Now we can select all with A on the keyboard, go up to Object, Relations, Make Single User, Object and Data. Now each object contains its own unique mesh. And again, if we hit A on the keyboard to make sure everything is selected, we can simply right click, go down to Convert to, and select Mesh. Give it a little second, and this has effectively applied all of our modifiers. And that includes the mirror modifiers here, but we want to affect these individually, so we need to ensure we have a left wing and a right wing. So to do so, let's just jump into wireframe and orthographic, snap to the front view, select everything on both wings, including the screws here, and then just hit Ctrl and J. This will join all of the geometry together. Now we can tap into edit mode with tab, just Alt A to make sure nothing is selected, and select one wing, hit P on the keyboard, separate by selection. Now back out into object mode, and moving to our solid view, we can see that we have two individual meshes now. That's great. We also don't need our master screw, so we can delete that with X on the keyboard. Okay, let's look at organizing our outliner. First of all, we can select our hide collection here, as this contained all of the bits that were used as cutters and the like, and we can right click and go delete hierarchy. That removes everything. We just check with our material view. Yep, we're still looking good. We want to create 3 new collections with our basic bot rigged selected. Let's go new collection. Let's just duplicate that a couple of times. And we want one to be body, one to be wings, and one to be bottom. This is just this little bottom bit here. Firstly, we can easily select our wings. Hit M on the keyboard, basic bot rigged, and then wings. Going to jump into orthographic and wireframe here to make the next bits easier. Just select the bottom bit here, move with M on the keyboard, move it to bottom collection, and everything else can be moved into the body. And now if we look back at our outliner here, you can see after collapsing them down, the only things remaining in our basic bot collection here are a camera and light, so we can just select everything else, right click, and delete hierarchy. Okay, great. Let's jump back out into our material preview just to check again whether we're all good. Looks good. All right, we're ready to move on to setting up our armature. In this video, we'll put together a quick plan for our rig using Blender's built-in annotation tools. We'll also estimate the center of gravity in order to place our armature and first root bone, and then proceed by using the mesh and objects to accurately place subsequent bones. Okay, it's time to start injecting an armature so we can begin animating this little robot. But before we do, I always find it handy to plan out exactly what we want to have move, translate, or rotate. So in order to do that, we can take advantage of the annotation tool within Blender's viewport. So to do that, it's over here on our tool palette. We just select the annotation option. With the further options residing in the options panel here on the right, we can hit N, go to view, and you can see we have our annotation options here. So I'm just going to delete the 2 that already exist, create a new one, give it a color. Let's give it a really strong orangey type color. And also go up to our solid shading options, do the little drop down, and let's just switch from random to material just so we have some more contrast when we start drawing over the top of our model. So again, let's hit N to hide that panel, and we can start choosing where to place our annotations, and we can do so with the shift and right click. So the first thing we'll definitely want to have rotate is these little wings here, because they'll be shifting up and down, almost like a little counterbalance. So they can do an up and down motion as if they were shifting around. However, they won't be moving on any other axis but this one. The same can be said here as well. For the antennas, I think these will be really nice for some secondary animation. So they'll sort of wobble up and down and just shake around a little bit. So we need to add bones to those. I'm thinking also these batteries, I know they would be static, but maybe we could add some sort of up and down movement as if there's sort of some old school piston action there. Could be nice, adds a little bit of extra visual interest. And the very bottom here can be free to move around on pretty much all axes really, almost acting as a tail, like a counterbalance. As for the lens, it would be really nice for the whole lens element to rotate, but also move in and out as if it was focusing or zooming. And also it would be kind of cool to set up the lens elements, as there are multiple elements that go down within the lens here, to just shift ever so slightly to give that illusion that it's focusing, it's moving the lens elements around. But we're going to kind of cheat that because we don't want to set up too complex of a rig. Okay, there are our annotations, which we can come back to, but at the moment, let's hide them because it feels like they are a little bit messy and we need the room to play around with the armature. So I'm just going to hide that. Again, I hit N on the keyboard and move back to our selection tool. Okay, let's look at introducing our armature. And when we add our armature, we will be adding our first bone as well. So we need to have that in the center of mass of our robot, which we need to kind of work out. I mean, Blender has some tools that help us do it. For example, if we select our body here and go up to set origin, we can set the origin to center of mass volume. However, just / here, we can see that we made big cuts into our robot body. So the volume of this particular object doesn't take into account all of the other stuff. That, and we have just different materials here. So the heavier metal bottom and the plastic top and all the guts inside as well. So we're just going to create the center of mass roughly where the edge is here. So to do so, we need to snap our cursor to that. So I'm just going to jump into wireframe, 5 on the number pad to go to orthographic, into edit mode, and just drag and select these vertices, and then Shift and S, cursor to selected, and that is what we're going to call our center of mass. So jumping back out into object mode and into solid view, let's do Shift A and place our armature. Now before we continue, it's worth going over to our armature options and just toggle down our viewport display and make sure our armature is in front so we can see at all times what we're doing. So this bone is huge. So let's jump into edit mode here, select all on the keyboard and scale. But we don't want to scale with a boundary box. We want to scale using the active element. So now we can scale and it scales down to the root of the bone. And this will be our root bone. Now we want to create a bone for the wings here so they can sort of flap, if you like, up and down, but we want to do so perfectly around the cylinder. So if we jump out into object mode, select our wing, jump into edit mode and into poly select with 3 along the top row of the number pad or up here, we can then select these 2 end caps, Shift and S, cursor to selected, jump out into object mode, select our bone or our armature, go into edit mode, and then do Shift and A, and this will add a bone directly where we placed our cursor. So now we can snap to our front view and just rotate it and scale it into place. Something like that looks reasonable. Let's jump back out into object mode, and we can always switch on our note to remind us of the next steps. Okay, we want to articulate the bottom bit here. So we can do so just by jumping into edit mode, selecting the bottom or the root of our root bone, hitting E to extrude and Z to move down. Now we want to align this with the bottom of the body, like so, and E again and Z move down. And we want to grab this and move it so the base of the bone aligns with the base of the bottom part here. But when we grab it, we're still attached to the other bone. So let's right click to drop that and hit Y on the keyboard. This separates the bone and allows us to hit G and Z or Z and move it down like so. Okay, let's move out and do the antennas here. Now, jumping back out into object mode, we want it to rotate around the base of the antenna here. So I'm just going to select the antenna, jump into edit mode, 2 along the number road, so we are on edges, and just select this edge loop by holding down Alt and left clicking. And then again, we can Shift and S, cursor to selected, jump back out into object mode, select our armature, go into edit mode and Shift A again, selecting the bone we just created and scaling it down. I think that will do nicely. We want a similar bone for our other antenna here, so we can just Shift and D to move it across. And click anywhere just to drop it somewhere. Go back out into object mode, select our second antenna. Again, select the edge loop, Shift and S, cursor to selected, back into our armature. With that bone selected, we can now do Shift and S, and instead of cursor to selected, we'll do selection to cursor. Those 2 are nicely lined up now. And for the batteries, thankfully, we have a pretty decent origin point because we just created cylinders for these originally. So we can use that by selecting the object, cursor to selected, going into our armature, Shift A, and doing the same again, cursor to selected, going into our armature, Shift A. Now we can select both of those bones, make sure we're on individual origins, and scale them down. That looks good. Now for our lens, again, we had a similar setup with a cylinder, so our origin is on point here. So let's just snap our cursor to that, go into our armature, again, Shift and A, but this time let's just rotate our lens about 90 degrees and scale it down. We're just going to hit G and move it in front of our lens ever so slightly. This will control the moving in and out and also the rotation of our lens, but we want another bone to control the lens element within it. So if we hit Shift and D and right click to drop, we can then rotate it 180 degrees, hit G, move it along the Y axis, and just align it with the very front element here. This will enable us to, in effect, take the lens here and scale it like that. It's a bit of a hack, but it'll look kind of cool. And finally, we have one more bone to create, and that is the wing on the other side. And to do so, we can mirror it across the origin point of our armature. So if we snap our cursor to selection, jump into edit mode, Shift and D to duplicate that bone, and right click to drop it in place. And now we can make sure that we are on 3D cursor as our transform pivot. And then we can just hit Control M and then X to mirror it across the X axis. Let's have a final look around. Okay, we have all of our bones exactly where we want them to be. In the next video, we'll look at parenting, creating a hierarchy of bones within the armature itself, but also to parent the various objects to said bone. In this video, we will be doing a lot of parenting. Not only will we be parenting bones to bones, but also objects to bones so that we can articulate all the moving parts of our robot and ensure that, say, when we move the body of our robot, the connecting parts follow. Okay, our armature is done, but if we jump into our pose mode with Control and Tab, we can see that we can grab our root bone and move it around, but nothing else follows, and this just doesn't work for our rig. So we need to parent all of our bones and create a hierarchy, as at the moment, if we expand down in our outliner here, you can see that there is no bone relations at all. So let's jump into edit mode, and then go ahead and select every bone we want to be parented to our body, with our body bone being selected last. And then just do Control and P and keep offset. And now we have some nice relationship lines that appear just to show us what's happening. We want to attach the bottom bit to this bone, so Control P, keep offset. And lastly, the lens element to the entire lens enclosure. Control P and keep offset. Now if we jump into pose mode and we hit G, we're grabbing the entire armature, but nothing else. The objects aren't following, so let's look at fixing that next. Okay, the first thing we want to parent to a bone is the main body here, and thankfully we have set up a collection in order to select all of our body elements, so we don't have to go in and select them all individually. So if up here in the outliner, we right-click our body collection, select objects, shift select our armature, hit tab to go in and make sure that our root bone is selected, jump back out into object mode, and now we can do Control and P. We want to parent to the bone. As you can see, all of the relationship lines have popped into place and to show that all of these objects are now parented to this bone. And if we were to go into a pose mode here and drag it around, you can see the effect. Let's go back out into object mode. And now we can do exactly what we did before. So just Alt-A to select none. This time we can select our bottom collection, right-click, select objects, then shift-select our armature, go into edit mode, make sure the bottom bone here is selected, back out into object mode, Control-P, set parent to bone. And let's Alt-A to deselect everything, and the rest we can pretty much do selecting manually now. So for this antenna, we want it paired to this bone. So let's select it, the armature, go into edit mode, select that bone, jump back out into object mode, Control P, bone. Same again with the other one, but this time selecting the other bone, back out into object mode, Control P, bone. Same with the batteries here. Again, just going in, selecting the bone I want, back out into object mode, Control P and bone. And the same for the wings. Select the object, the armature, go into edit mode, select the bone we want to parent to, jump back out into object mode, Control P and bone. And just one more. Let's move over and concentrate on our lens. But before we do, let's first select our armature and rename it with F2 on the keyboard and call it Basic Bot. So the first thing we want to do is parent the entire lens container to this front bone here. So let's select everything we want there. As you will probably remember, we have a bit of text here, which is tricky to see until we switch over to our random color options in our viewport shading. So we can select it, the lens housing, then our armature, go into edit mode, and just make sure our front bone here is selected. Go back out to object mode, Control P, and parent to bone. Let's just check. Looking good. Now we want our main lens elements to be parented to the flipped bone here, but we don't want the other lens parts to follow. So let's just jump into edit mode. Select those two bits with L on the keyboard, hit P, separate by selection. Now we can jump back out into object mode and only select our main lens element, go into our armature, make sure that flipped bone is selected, jump back out to object mode, Control P, and parent to bone. Now this is all well and good, but because we separated the lens mesh, this no longer has a parent. So just to quickly fix that, with it selected, we can shift select our armature, go into edit mode, make sure our main bone is selected, back out into object mode and just parent that to bone. Now we are all ready to go and we can test that by moving our entire rig around. We can also test it by selecting all of our bones and making sure our pivot point is set to individual origins, hitting R on the keyboard twice to go into orbit rotation. And you can see that all of our bones are rotating around their prescribed pivot points. However, as you can also see, they're doing things they really shouldn't be doing, not the mechanical intent of our design, let's say. So in the next video, we're going to look at setting up some constraints in order to avoid this happening. In this video, we are going to set up bone constraints in order to avoid movement on axes that don't align with the mechanics of our bot. This will come in handy later for when we automate some animation. We'll also look at setting up the flexible bellow-like join between the body and bottom of our basic bot. Okay, let's start with the wings. So we can jump into pose mode here with Control and Tab and try and work out the axis we want to rotate on. And this is not immediately apparent by looking at the bone. Thankfully, we can help ourselves out by just expanding the properties menu here and going into armature options and under viewport display, just checking axis on so we can see the axes we are working with. And as you can see here, we want to rotate about the Z or Z axis. But what if your Z axis is pointing in a different orientation? Well, in this case, we need to recalculate the roll, and we can see the roll by jumping into edit mode with Tab, then N on the keyboard to bring up our side panel. And then under the item option here, you can see we can adjust the roll so that our Z is pointing negative along the global Y axis. And in fact, we can make that number much more accurate by using Shift and N and recalculating it along the global negative Y. And that gives us a corrected value of 122. Now, if we jump back out into object mode, we have a little bit of a problem. So what we need to do is select the offending object, Alt and P, clear the parent, and then Shift select our armature again. Just go into edit mode here to make sure we have that bone selected. And now Control and P and bone. And we are back where we need to be with the right orientation, if it wasn't already set like this. So if we go over to our bone constraint options, add a bone constraint and just limit the rotation. And now we want to limit everything but the Z axis. So I'm just going to limit X and Y. Now this looks like it has broken it, and it hasn't for the world space, but it has for our local space. So let's just change our owner from world space to local space. And that has fixed it. So we can rotate it any way we want and it'll only move up and down on that z-axis. Now we want to do the same for the other wing here, and although it didn't take particularly long to set up, there is a very quick way of doing it, and that is just by selecting it, selecting the bone we have our constraint on, and then going up to Pose, Constraints, Copy Constraint to Selected Bone, and that has copied over exactly what we want. And as we mirrored this bone, everything just automatically works. Most of the other bones here we don't really need to set up limits for, but one that would be very handy would be our lens enclosure here, as it would be nice to just grab it to animate and not have to worry about it shearing or like cutting into other objects. For that, we need to limit the location. So again, let's move under our bone constraints, add bone constraint, and this time choose limit location. And we can just click and hold on X and just move our mouse all the way down to limit all of the locations here. And again, we don't want it in the world space, as this would just slap it in the middle of our scene. We want it in its own local space, but we do want to give it a little bit of movement so it can move in and out, and that is on the Y axis here. So let's say it can move out 1 centimeter and move it in 0.5 centimeters, so minus 0.5 centimeters. And now if we grab it, you can see we can move it in and out ever so slightly, but it limits the range for us. So let's right click to drop that, move back out to our robot and just see if everything's working still. Yep, we're still good. Back into pose mode. Now the only other element that doesn't really work if we move into the front view here and grab our bottom bone is this accordion type effect, this bellows effect, which should be somewhat flexible and stay attached to the bottom here. So I'm just going to Alt and G to reset the position, jump out into object mode, select our bellows, Alt and P, clear parent. Now we want to, instead of parenting it directly to the bone, we want to deform this mesh element based on this bone on the top part and this bone on the bottom part. So in order to do that, we need to reparent it to the armature first. So select it, the armature, Control P, and instead of bone, we're going to do armature deform with empty groups. Okay, now jumping into edit mode, let's just make a note of our bones here. We have bone 3 and bone 2, perfect. We go over to our groups here. We can delete everything but bone 3 and bone 2, and then jump in to weight paint mode by hitting Control and Tab and going to weight paint. And bone 3 is our bottom bone. We can use our gradient tool here to drag out a weight from the bottom here to the top. And on bone 2, we can do the complete inverse from the top to the bottom. Now if we go out to object mode, select our armature, go into pose mode and hit grab, can see the effect we are having. Now you can, of course, tweak this as well if you aren't totally happy with the fall off, but I'm pretty happy with that. So let's move on to setting up some drivers in order to automate some actions. So when we move one bone, another bone will move in relation to it. In this video, we will be using drivers to automate the rotation of our lens element, as well as automate the motion of our batteries so they shift up and down. Okay, our constraints are all done, but now we are going to save our future selves a hell of a lot of hassle by setting up some automation on our animation in the form of drivers. But firstly, because I find them annoying, I'm just going to switch off the reference lines here, which you can do so by going up to viewport overlays and then uncheck relationship lines. That is much better. So let's move in to our first driver here by going into pose mode with Control Tab and selecting our bone and hitting the period key is affect the rotation when we grab our controller and move it in and out to zoom. So in order to do that, we need to see our item properties. So if we hit N on the keyboard to open the side panel and go up to item, you can see all of our transform options here. Now we want to switch our rotation type. Quaternion is amazing. It's really good for avoiding gimbal lock where two axes align and limit the rotation, but we want a more mechanical effect here. So we're going to just switch to the simple X, Y, Z coordinates. And we want that to affect our entire rig. So while in pose mode, if we hit A, hold down Alt while clicking the drop down, and then select X, Y, Z Euler. Now all of our bones have taken on that rotation paradigm. Okay, let's go back into our lens bone and look at setting it up. So what we want to have happen is when we grab the bone and move it in and out, we want the entire lens enclosure to rotate. And we want to rotate it about the Y, and we want to reference the Y location of the bone. So under our item properties here, let's right click the Y rotation and add driver. Now our target here, which is the variable, we can select our basic bot rig, and then bone 8, which as you can see on the top left hand corner, is the name of the bone we have selected. Now we want to reference the Y location, and we don't want to reference it in the world space. We want to use the transform space. The local space also works, but I've found inconsistencies when it's parented and has other constraints attached to it. So we're going to go with the transform space. Now, jumping out, if we hit grab, move our lens element in and out, it's kind of doing it, but you'd have to have eagle eyes to spot the rotation. So let's increase the amplitude of this effect by going in, this time just left clicking into our driver field and adjusting the equation here, which is variable, i.e. our Y location of our bone, plus, well, nothing. So let's just delete the plus nothing and multiply it by 50. Now when we grab the bone, yes, that is much better. But as you can see, we can continue moving it, which might be the effect we want, but in this case it isn't. So let's just, with our bone selected, jump back into our bone constraints and just make sure effect transform is selected on our limit location. This will just limit the rotational element as well. So when we grab it now, it just rotates in and out like so. Okay, that's looking good. Now we want to have our lens elements also affected by this movement. So let's select our flipped bone here, and we want to have it affect the scale. So it sort of zooms in and out like that, which is a kind of fake lens movement. So let's right click the Y scale, add driver. Again, we want to select our rig and then our bone 8, Y location, and transform space, just like before. Up here, we have our variable +1. This acts as the length of our bone. So this is the scale, the default scale, and we want to keep that. So let's test the bone out. All right, it's not doing much. So let's, like before, increase the effect by left clicking in and multiplying that variable by, let's go with 50. Now let's grab our front bone here. Wow, yeah, that's doing a lot. So let's just turn that down ever so slightly. Let's go with 20. Okay, cool. Now it doesn't look like it's doing much here, but if we jump over to our material view and hit grab, you can see that the lens elements kind of look like they're moving about, which is the effect we want. On a side note, as you can see, when we're moving in and out here, we're getting a lot of ghosting and sort of shimmering. This is the multi-sampling of the viewport. We can stop that happening if we go over to our render options, just make sure we are on Eevee, and turn our viewport sampling down to 1. And now when we grab it, it's nice and clean, if a little bit noisy. Okay, jumping back to solid mode and out, we can concentrate on our second bone automation here. And these will be these battery/piston type things. I'm not entirely sure what they do yet, but we're going to make a move and that'll look cool. So let's look at making those sort of jump up and down with the use of a driver and some mathematics. In order to automate the movements of our batteries up and down, we will be using the cosine function, which, as you can see from this handy online graphic calculator, draws a simple sine wave. In fact, I found this website very handy for testing drivers, so I'll leave a link to it in the description. We can also use the same operators like multiply and divide as we would do in Blender. So let's look at setting that up now. Okay, so we're back in our Blender scene now, and we can go into pose mode and select our required bone. And we want to affect the Y location. Now we can right click and go to add driver, but we can also left click and hit the hashtag key, and this just tells Blender that we're about to write an expression. So let's write out as it was in the website, COS for cosine, bracket. Now we need a variable here that isn't just X because that's just a placeholder. So let's give it the frame number, which will change so we can animate it. And then close the bracket. Okay, something's happened. Let's press play. Yes, it seems to be doing it, but the amplitude and frequency is crazy high. So instead of multiplying it like we did previously, let's just left click in, divide it by, let's say 25, still kind of strong. Let's divide it by 100, nice. And it's going a little fast for my taste. So let's also divide this variable by 2. Perfect. Okay, we want to copy that to the other bone. So we can right click, copy driver, select our other bone, right click and paste driver. We don't want them to be happening together, so we want to create an offset. So if we click in here, as well as dividing the frame, we can also remove by minus, let's say 3 frames. And now we have a nice offset. Okay, those are our drivers all hooked up, but before we jump into animating, I think it's worth just one more video to look at how we can visually organize these bones in a much more pleasing way. This is especially handy if you are handing this rig off to an animator who hasn't necessarily built the rig or models before and just makes it a hell of a lot easier to use. So let's save our work and I'll see you in the last video for this chapter. Now this step isn't an essential requirement as we can animate our armature as is. However, I still think it's a valuable process to acknowledge. As rigs become more and more complex, navigating around the various eccentricities can become very time consuming. In this video, we will look at 3 organizational methods: custom bones, bone groups, and bone layers, which together can dramatically improve our rig's ease of use and also make it look way better too. Alright, first things first, to improve the look of our rig here, let's just jump into our armature options, viewport display, and uncheck axes as we don't really need to use these anymore. Now, in order to set up our first custom bone shape, we need to create a mesh that will be that shape. So with our cursor in the middle, cursor to world origin, let's just create a cube. And let's hit G and just move it off and maybe scale it down a bit so it isn't too in the way. And then select our armature, Control Tab into pose mode, select our main body bone here, go over to our bone options, and then under viewport display, we have a custom object option. And if we click the eyedropper here, we can just select the object we just created and it'll use that shape. But this is not exactly ideal. So let's just select wireframe here along the bottom. That's a little easier. And we can adjust the shape even further by going out into object mode, selecting the object we just created, jumping into edit mode and scaling it, let's say along the Y, noting that the Y of our bone is up, but the Y of our object is the depth here. So we go scale Y, something like that. That looks good. Back out into object mode. Let's move this into a new collection, basic bot rigged, new collection, and call it hide. Now in our outliner, we can do just that by unchecking it. Now the only other bone we're really going to control is the zoom here in our lens, moving that in and out. So maybe that could be a nice arrow which indicates its action. So again, back out into object mode. Let's add a mesh, this time a plane. I'm going to isolate it with /. Let's jump into edit mode, add an edge loop along the X and 2 along the Y. Select the vertices here, hit M on the keyboard and merge at center. Now we can go to poly mode with 3 along the number row, select these 2, hit X and delete faces. Now we can hit A to select everything and just F to fill it all with one polygon. Then E and extrude it up ever so slightly. A to select all, G, Z, or Z and move it down ever so slightly. Okay, let's jump back out into object mode and / to remove that isolation. Hit G, move it to the side, select our armature, Control and Tab, select our front element here and do exactly the same as we did before. So bone options, custom object, eyedropper, select our custom object, and we have an issue. This is, we want this pointing outwards basically. And we can adjust the object, but we also have these handy transform tools here. So we can rotate it 180 degrees like so. And let's scale it down by 0.5. Okay, cool. Back out into object mode, and we can move our now redundant object into its hide collection. And now let's look at how bone groups can help us out. So if we select our armature, go into pose mode, and under armature options here, we have a bone groups menu item. So let's drop that down. Just going to select all the bones, and on the plus icon here, let's give it a group, and let's call it passive. Let's assign a color, something quite desaturated. Let's go with that, and assign all the bones to it. Now we can select our 3 automated bones here, which are driven by drivers, create a new bone group, call it auto, and let's give it a dark orangey brown color, and assign. And then let's select the bones we're actually going to animate. So this is our main body bone here, and our front lens element. And let's call that group animate. Let's give it a nice healthy green color. It's just a nice way to categorize our bones by color, with the added benefit being you can also just select them via this bone group menu. Okay, and last but not least, we're going to look at bone layers, which are fairly simple, but probably the most powerful in hiding the back end of things we don't want an animator to touch. So in this case, we want to firstly Alt-A to make sure we don't have any bones selected. Then over to our bone groups, we can select passive, select auto, then hit M on the keyboard and move it to a second bone layer. Now I'm going to switch our viewport color back to material here, and we can see we have 2 very simple controllers, with the rest of our bones being either passive or just automating themselves. And with that done, we are finally ready to move on to the animation chapter. So let's save our progress, and I'll see you in said chapter. Alright, animation. Time to bring our little basic bot to life with a simple boot up sequence. I really like this part. But before we run, we need to walk, and we'll do so by jumping into a little bit of theory, looking at some of the principles of animation, and then start by blocking out some of the basic poses of our animation. We'll then dive into the graph editor to refine the curves and mimic some object inertia. And after some intensive animation, we will rest on our laurels and look at how the Wiggle Bones add-on can do a lot of the heavy lifting for us, with a drawback being that we have to bake out our animation prior to render, but we'll look into how to do that as well. And finally, we will look at how to animate the camera, including the addition of a motion modifier to give a handheld feel to the motion. And by the end of this chapter, we will have a fully animated basic bot character that builds upon the fundamental principles to create an expressive animation that makes our previously static character feel much more alive. Not bad for a little boxy robot. In this video, we'll briefly talk about some principles of animation and then start blocking out our animation. Having our basic box start on the ground and then fly up to eye level, look around a little bit, and then finally do a 360 spin. Although our boot up animation will be quite simple, I think it's still good to acknowledge some fundamental principles of animation. These principles are widely accredited to the 1981 book, Disney Animation, The Illusion of Life. And we're going to cherry pick a few to help us out with our bucket bot action. But you can read more about them in a link in the description. Now within these principles, straight ahead and pose to pose are discussed as ways to animate. Straight ahead being chronologically, so starting at frame 1 and then animating all the way to the end, and pose to pose involving setting out our key poses first, and then in-betweening all the details afterwards. These principles were initially used to refer to traditional 2D animation, but are still relevant today with CG animation. However, there is another approach that's handy to employ in CG animation as well, and that is the layered approach. This builds upon the previous methods by building up motion in layers, usually starting with broader movements and then adding secondary and tertiary animation afterwards. This is a very powerful way to plan out your animation without committing too much time as well, and it's the method we will be using now. So let's start by blocking out the motion of just our root bone. Alright, it's finally time to start animating, so let's select our armature, hit Ctrl and Tab to go into pose mode and select our main root bone. Making sure our timeline is on frame 1 just by hitting the jump to endpoint button, and then commit our first frame. And we can do so by hovering over the viewport and hitting I, location and rotation, as we're not going to be really scaling this robot. And to make our lives even easier, we can engage auto key here just above the timeline so that whenever we move a bone, it automatically injects a keyframe. So if we were to position our robot into the first pose, so just resting on the ground, hit G and Z or Z and rest it right on the ground there, it automatically places the keyframe in there. Okay, now that we are all set up, we can continue with our second pose, which is up in the air basically. But before we do, we want a little bit of a wait, a little beat before that happens. So acknowledging the fact that we are in a 24 frames per second timeline, let's select our first key, hit Shift and D and move it over to roughly 24. So it's a second before any action happens. And this bar just indicates that between these two keyframes, nothing has changed. And then we boost up into the sky. So let's give it half a second or so, hit G and Z and move it up into the sky. It's also handy to switch on perspective here so we can appreciate what it's going to look like more through a camera. And again, let's rewind spacebar. Oh, that feels good. Kind of happens over the right amount of time. So after it hits that height, let's again Shift D in the timeline here to give it another little beat before it rotates to look around. So let's tap R twice on the keyboard to enter into orbit mode and have the robot look to its left. Again, add a little beat here in the timeline with Shift D. It readjusts where it's looking ever so slightly. Again, another beat, maybe a shorter beat. Another little micro movement. And then just sort of shifts about, almost as if it were a human eye, which likes to sort of dart around to see its surroundings. Okay, that looks good. Another hold here, so Shift and D before it looks completely in the other direction, just to fully survey the area. And again in the timeline, duplicate R key to add a hold, move ahead a few frames and create a new pose. And hold a little less time, new pose, and then hold a little bit more. And now we just want it to spin, it feels safe now, it's looked at its surrounding and it's just going to spin 360 and return to an idle position. So after that hold, let's give it about a second to spin 360. And we're going to add this keyframe by using the item properties. So hit N on the keyboard, go up to item, and then rotation, we want our Y axis. If you're not too sure what axis the bone is on, you can go back to your armature options here and just make sure axes is checked. So Y is the axis we want. And we can just jump in and add, so plus 360 degrees. Doesn't look like anything has happened, but now we have a 360 degree motion. But actually what we want to do is to have our robot end up exactly looking ahead. So let's just change our Y to 360 and we can zero out the other axes. So it is level. Let's just play that through again. Up, look about, everything's safe, cool. I'll do my 360 and stop. And that is the blocking stage pretty much done. And the reason why we're taking this layered approach is because at this point, it's really, really easy to adjust timings. So if we ever want slightly longer pauses or, we need to align it to another action or another element, then we can do so very easily. So in the next video, let's look at adding some more complexity to our animation and bring in some of those animation principles. In this video, we will jump into the curves editor and look at how we can use follow-through, overlap, and anticipation to add the next layer of complexity to our animation. Okay, we have the blocked out motion of our basic bot, but we want to add a little bit more realism and character. So let's take advantage of some animation principles. The first being follow through. This is just a way of mimicking inertia, which every object with mass has. And we mimic this by both over and under shooting our motion until we resolve gently to our end keyframe. Let's just jump over to Blender. So if we drag out a new window here and switch our second window over to Graph Editor, you can see we have already populated our animation curves by adding in these keyframes, and Blender by default adds a nice Bezier ease in and out of our animation. So for example, if we wanted a little bit more effort at the start here to shift the weight, we could select the point of our Y location and just hit S and scale that ever so slightly so the ease in is stronger, so it feels a little bit heavier lifting off the ground. But unless it's amazing control on behalf of our robot here, we want to give it a little bit of a wobble when it hits the top. Let's show you what I mean by jumping into the curves. So we are on our Y location here. If you don't want to be distracted by anything else, you can just double click the Y location channel and hit Shift and H to hide all of the other channels. Also, we have a lot of keys that are basically the same over time. You can get rid of those by just selecting all, going up to Key, and then Clean Keyframes. This removes any keyframes with an adjacent keyframe that has the same value. Okay, now we're in the position where we can create some overshoot and undershoot. So I'm just going to select the out keyframe here. This is the keyframe where we have reached the apex of our motion, and just hit Shift and D and then X to move it across time. So we create the new end of our motion right here. And this gives us the opportunity, let's move it back a little bit, to create some overshoot and undershoot. So our first overshoot, we just grab and move our keyframe up, you can see what it does. So it overshoots and goes back down. So that's our first overshoot. Again, we can Shift D and create an undershoot, and this would have slightly less energy, so it would deviate from our end location slightly less, and it has that nice inertial bounce to it. So let's give ourselves a bit more room, create one more tiny overshoot here, and I'm reasonably happy with that. If at any point the handles of your curves get messed up, which can happen now and again, you can hit V on the keyboard and just change the keyframe type. I find auto clamped is pretty handy in restoring the default Bezier curve. Okay, we have some nice follow through for our bot taking off, but now let's look at the spin and adding some follow through there as well. First, we can hit Alt and H to unhide all of our curves, and you can see quite obviously which curve we are going for, and that is the Y rotation. So let's double click the channel, Shift and H, and just look at doing something similar at the other end. So we can select our Alt key, Shift and D, move it over, and just create a little bit of an oscillation here. Cool, that feels nice to me. Now another principle we can look at is overlap. And this is where the motion of attached items offset ever so slightly in time from our original main motion. So for example, we're going to add a little bit more front weight to our bot by animating the X rotation. So let's select the X rotation in our curve channels, double click and hit the period key to fill the window. And again, let's clean our keyframes, so clean keyframes. And what we want to have happen is when the bot lifts off the ground, we want it to lift and tilt forward ever so slightly as if the lens is heavier, which I think it would be than the rest of the bot. So at our start position, let's just make sure with Shift D, we have a keyframe to hold that. And then as we move up, let's Shift D and rotate the bot forward. So it lifts up. And when it reaches the apex here, we want it to fall back. And in order to see the keys of our other Y location channel, we can just switch it on and also take advantage of the normalize option, which just squidges all of the curves into one space so we can edit them together easily. So it tilts forward when it moves up, and it reaches the apex of our movement upwards. We want it to tilt back. So we can Shift D and tilt quite heavily back in the other direction. We want that to happen after it reaches the apex. So it tilts back afterwards. So then it kind of flips up. You kind of see the action here. And as it shifts down here, we can duplicate that frame and have it tilt back down. And then I'm just going to even things out so we have nice smooth arcs. So our motion then looks like, as we have offset our X rotation, looks something like that, which is nice, much more bouncy and appealing. After our bot has settled in the air, we don't need to do quite as much follow through for the looking around, as it's only small movements and the weight shifting around isn't going to be that extreme. But it does still take some energy to move. So it feels like when we gain movement here, we should lose it somewhere else. So when we rotate, it feels like we would dip ever so slightly and then correct. So let's just take our Y location here and we would be back up to our normal height. But then in order to rotate, we'd lose a little bit of altitude, dip down and then up. And then again, we could introduce a little bit of over and undershoot, making sure that lines up nicely. And for those little micro movements, I think we're good to stay as is. But then we have another big move here. So let's dip down again to compensate for the energy used. Dip down and then up. And again, let's create some over and undershoot. And for this move, we're using a lot of energy. So it feels like we would dip down quite a lot more. So let's just duplicate our key, hit X so we can constrain it across the time. And then we dip down a lot here and then back up and a tiny bit of undershoot and overshoot. And like we did with our X rotation here, we can create a tiny bit of offsetting to give the feeling of weight on the front element. So when we have a dip down, we duplicate that and also have a dip down but offset. And overshoot and undershoot. Bit too strong here. So we can, I mean, it's a nice wobble, but I think it feels a bit too light. So what we can do is select our keyframes, make sure we are on 2D cursor, and just scale across time, with our timeline cursor being the origin point. Again, we have kind of messed up handles here, so we can select them all, hit V, and auto clamp. Nice. Okay, let's look at adding some tilting rotation overlap for our spin. Feels like we would dip down a lot. Okay, slightly after our loss in altitude. And then when we start resolving, we'd flip way back up again, slightly after. And then we'd do our follow through by under and overshooting a few frames after our Y location keys. And again, making sure our overlap and underlap is less and less over time. Now, the last principle we are going to look at is anticipation. This is a kind of pre-action to prepare the viewer for our primary action. In this case, I think it would be nice to have our bot lean forward ever so slightly before it boosts up into the sky here. So the reason we're leaning forward is not really because that's how mechanically this robot would function, but more to humanize it, to anthropomorphize it. So this would effectively be a human head, almost thinking of it like that, which kind of leans forward in order to prepare to stand up. It's a tricky one to explain, but let's just look at setting that up. So with our root bone selected, let's choose a place between our two hold keyframes and add a key on location and rotation, and just rotate, snapping to our side view, rotate forward a little bit, compensating with the location. So it leans forward and it holds that key before it starts shooting up into the sky. And we want to just create that forward lean a little bit more prominent here. So it leans and then bolts up. So it gives a little bit of preparation before that happens. And as we move on to our spin here, we want, again, a similar type of anticipation. We want it to wind up to that big spin. So in order to do so, it's spinning anti-clockwise. So we want to have it spin on the Y rotation, slightly clockwise. So let's grab our curves here, create a slight clockwise motion, and then it spins up. Again, giving it that little bit of anticipation. You might want to add a new set of keys here. So we can add location rotation. And then after we wound up, maybe we want to lean back a little bit and then fully boost into that motion. The only other thing I think it would be beneficial to do is to add a little bit more of an up and down wobble, because it's almost as if it's floating. It wouldn't just sort of be locked quite so much on that local Y axis. So let's select our Y location in the graph editor, hide everything else, and see what we've got here. And we can see, although we do have some overlap motion, a lot of the action kind of exists on one line. So in order to increase the floating feel, I think we can afford to add a little bit more bobbing up and down. Just going to do that by duplicating a few keys here, selecting a key in the middle so it moves up initially. I think it can move down a bit, and we can use proportional editing to adjust the surrounding keys. So I'm just going to switch that on. If you hit the grab key and then start scrolling, you can see what we're doing here. We just want to create a larger sort of oscillating feeling. So let's just move this down, perhaps this up, this down a little bit more. So we have a constant floating feeling. So there is never a point when it is very static in the air. And we can continue this trend after the fact just by creating a few keyframes like so. All right, I feel like we have injected way more character into our bot beyond the initial blocking phase. We looked at follow through to mimic some inertia, and we looked at overlap for our connected elements and channels to reinforce that weight. We also looked at anticipation, which injects some intent into our motion. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can get a lot of this follow through and the overlap for free with the Wiggle Bones add-on. In this video, we will look at how to use Wiggle Bones, a fantastic add-on that automatically adds some secondary wiggle to any bone it's activated on. Now, Wiggle Bones isn't native to Blender. It's an add-on currently still under development, and you can download it from blenderartist.org. There is a link down in the description. Here we're going to choose, as of the time of recording, the latest one, which is the B20 suffix, beta 20, I assume. So let's just click that to download. Then jump back into our Blender, go up to Edit, Preferences, and then to Add-ons and Install. After you have located the add-on, click Install Add-on, and after a little bit of time it will pop into view, and here we can just check this checkbox to activate the add-on. Now we can close our preferences, and 3 new menu items have appeared. One is under our scene here, so we have Wiggle Scene, and if we uncheck and check this, we effectively deactivate and activate Wiggle Bones on a scene level, so everything with Wiggle Bones will be affected. We also have an armature level, the Wiggle Armature, so we can deactivate the effect local to each armature, and then the bone options, where we have access to the variables that actually control the motion of our bone. So let's just look at all of these options. Here we have our Wiggle Bone options ramping up and down over time. With stiffness, the higher the value, the faster the wiggle. With dampening, the higher the value, the more resistance there is. With amplitude rotation, the higher the value, the more the bone rotates. With amplitude translation, the higher the value, the more the bone translates. And with stretch, the higher the value, the more the bone stretches. And gravity, the higher the value, the more the bone droops under the force of gravity. So in order to activate it on the bones we want, let's just move over to our armature here and select our second layer. These are the bones we kind of put away for the time being. Let's just expand our working area by going to the top right-hand corner of our viewport, click and dragging over to the right to join up the 2 windows. Now we want our wings to wobble, we want our antenna to wobble, and we want the bottom unit here to wobble also. So with those all selected, we can go over to our bone options and just scrolling down to Wiggle Bones here. While holding Alt, click the checkbox. Now all of the bones have Wiggle Bones activated on them. And if we rewind our animation and play it through, you can see we got some funky results here. And that's because we need to tweak our settings. So let's stop the animation, expand our view here. First of all, we don't want any of them to shift location. So the amplitude translation, we can hold Alt, click in and hit 0. We don't want any stretching either. So we can hold Alt, click in and hit 0. Now if we rewind and look back, cool, we don't have any disconnecting parts anymore, but it's not doing a huge amount. So let's just hold down Alt, click into our amplitude rotation and type in 150. Now you can see we are starting to get some really good motion here. Gravity, I think it works well for our bottom unit. I don't think we want it on the wings or our antenna because they will be too light. So let's select those, Alt-click gravity, hit 0. Now we can tweak the stiffness and dampening for each. And I find it nice to give a bit of variation. So if we were, for example, to go to our antenna here, they would be quite light. So the stiffness would be quite high. So let's select the two antenna. And I'm just going to drag the stiffness up a little bit. Let's just play that through. Feels a lot nicer. However, they're moving together in unison, which is, I mean, they are the same antenna, so they would kind of do that, but it feels nice to give a little bit of an offset here. So let's just bring the stiffness of one down a little bit. Yeah, so we have some nice offset here, which just makes it a hell of a lot more visually interesting. If you feel like the bones are getting in the way, we can jump into our armature, go under display options and change the display type from octahedral to stick. That's looking good. I think the wings here aren't moving that much. So let's go back into our bone options here and increase rotation, holding down Alt to affect both. Looking pretty good. I think they could afford to be a little bit stiffer. And again, like with the antenna, let's select one and change the variables slightly. Let's go to 0.3. Looks good. I think the bottom part perhaps is moving a little bit too wobbly, a little bit too jelly-like. So let's increase the gravity to 0.8, decrease the stiffness to 0.15, and just change the dampening down to 0.1 so the effect lasts longer. Okay, that's kind of the right feeling, although it seems to be moving a little bit too much. So let's just change the amplitude rotation down to 50. Okay, let's switch off our overlay so we can really get a feeling for it. Yeah, that feels kind of nice. And it's also just super handy to have this as a real-time feedback in the viewport. However, it is just in the viewport. As soon as you want to render this animation, this effect gets lost along the way. So in order to make sure we can render it, we need to bake the animations of these wiggle bones, which we will look to do in the next video. In this video, we'll bake out the dynamic animation of our wiggle bones into actual keyframes in order to render our scene. We'll also take a look at the non-linear animation editor and how we can layer actions in order to revert any baked animation. Okay, let's look at baking our wiggle bones. Now there is a handy option to do so in the wiggle bone settings on the bone properties, but unfortunately on my version of Blender at least, it doesn't fully work. You can use this select wiggle bones button, which very handily selects all bones with the wiggle bone option checked, but we can't use bake wiggle. This causes an error on Blender 3.3 with beta 20 of the add-on. However, I am seeing this as a good opportunity to go through the manual process, as you might need to do this on other tasks anyway. So before we go and bake manually, let's just go up to our armature options here and just check all the bones and select all. As you can see, we can see all of the keyframes that we did in a previous video to manually key our root bone. And if we drag out a new window here on the top right and change it from the 3D viewport to non-linear animation, we can see those keys are represented as a single action, which we can drop down into a track like a layer. So if we click that button, that does exactly that. And as you can see, our keyframes have disappeared, but we can always gain access to them again by over our NLA editor, just hitting tab, and this brings back our keys. I think of it a lot like an object data block with the mesh within it, as you do very similar for modeling. We have effectively protected the animation on our bone here. So we can deselect all of our bones with Alt and A, go back to our bone options, scroll down, go to select wiggle bones, and then we can go up to pose, animation, bake action. And just make sure we have visual keying enabled, as this will bake whatever it sees in the viewport as opposed to just the animation channels. Okay, everything else is good. Let's click OK. Okay, it's laid down a bunch of keyframes on top of the action we have already banked. So now if we go to our armature options and switch off wiggle bones, you can see we still have the motion that was created by the wiggle bones. That is because we now have it within this action. So we can see what that looks like in our graph editor, and it's a whole lot of complicated stuff that if we were to hand animate would take us a hell of a long time. So this is just a fantastic way to save ourselves a considerable amount of time. Now we can go back to our new live channel here and drop it down into our animation track and just go to the strip option and rename it Wiggle. So now if we hit A on our 3D viewport, you can see we have no keys, but we can always uncheck the channel here and see our base animation switching back on our wiggle armature to go back into our wiggle bone options and make further refinements. But we don't want to do that, so let's just switch it off and switch back on our baked version because I'm really liking that effect and I want to render it out. But before we do, we are missing one important element, and that is the animation of our lens here. So let's look at animating that final element, as well as animating our actual scene camera in the next video. In this video, we'll be animating two cameras. The camera built into our basic bot, accentuating the animation, having the bot look around, injecting a little bit more character, but also the Blender camera, giving it an operated feel as if a person was actually behind the camera. First thing is first, let's finish the animation on our basic bot by animating our lens in and out. As you can see, we still have our non-linear animation window or NLA editor open. And if we were to set a key for our lens on the location only as it rotates automatically, we can see that a new track has been placed on top of both. So we are animating this bone in isolation on a new layer. With that said, let's just close that editor and start animating. Let's have our first lens motion happen in line with the anticipation movement here. So we can add a key. We can use available this time, which will add a key to everything we have already established keyframes for, in this case, location. And when it tilts forward, maybe we just grab it and pull it out a little bit and push it back in as if it's kind of doing a startup type effect. Okay, then we boost up into the sky and look around. And this is where we can have the camera lens shuffle in and out a lot. So let's add a keyframe on available for a hold, zoom out, Shift D to hold a little bit, zoom back in and correct a little bit, zooming out, another little hold. See what that looks like. Yeah, it's nice. Surveying the area. And it does something similar while it looks around here. Let's introduce another hold with Shift D. Grab it. Another little hold. And out with a slight readjustment. And maybe a longer hold. And all the way back in. Now we have the build up to the rotation, which is fine. So let's hold throughout that whole process. And then do our last flurry of lens activity. Here I'm just hitting G to pull it out and back a little bit. Cool. Let's just look at our whole animation. It's subtle, but I really like the added motion here. Okay, that didn't take too long. And if we drag out a new window here, we always have the option to jump to our nonlinear animation window, drop down that action, under strip, and give it the name Bot Lens to keep ourselves organized. All right, let's move on to animating our actual Blender camera. And before we do, we need to jump out of pose mode into object mode with Control and Tab. Make sure our 3D cursor is in the world center with Shift and S, cursor to world origin. And then we can add a camera with Shift and A and just select camera. Let's going to move this out the side here. And you can see we have a little triangle, or a big triangle, on top of our camera that is empty. It's not filled in. This is because it is not the active camera. And we can make it the active camera by just hitting Control and 0 on the number pad. And that also jumps into it. Let's just move back out so we can see our basic bot and choose a nice vantage point. I think that works. So now we can hold Control Alt and 0, and that just snaps our camera to that perspective view. And just to make sure that's locked in, let's hit I and add a keyframe on location and rotation. Okay, now we can refine our camera lens a little bit. So I'm just going to hit G and the Z key twice on the keyboard to move in on the local axis, as well as just shifting it around so that it's framed up nicely. Okay, now let's animate the camera following the robot action. And to do so, we'll do it slightly delayed, as if it has taken the camera operator a second to work out what's going on. So after it starts lifting off, let's add a key on our location and rotation, and it reaches the top. We'll grab the camera, move it along the Z-axis slightly, and then complete the action by rotating along the local X-axis, so we can focus in here. Just kind of looks like that. And then maybe once we get to the top, we track sideways along the bot just to give a little bit more dynamism. Just grab the camera, then rotate along the Z. So it's sort of doing a very gentle slide. Okay, that's really it for our camera animation, but it does look a little bit boring and over mechanical. So let's introduce more of an operated feel by adding a little handheld wobble with curve modifiers. All right, let's start by going up to the top right of our viewport here and dragging out a new window and changing our viewport from 3D viewport to graph editor. And if we drop down our channels here, we can see everything we have to work with. For the sake of cleanliness, let's just select all of our scales here and hit X, because we don't need them, because we won't be scaling our camera at all. And now we can select our first channel on the list, go over to modifiers, add modifier, and choose noise. Let's just play through and see what that looks like. It's quite erratic, kind of feels like there's an earthquake going on. Let's increase the scale, decrease the strength to something like 0.03. And now we have a sort of nice, gentle oscillation. I also like to up the depth as well. This just adds a second layer of complexity. And if we zoom in on our waveform, we can see what it's doing. That seems pretty good. Let's copy that effect and go through our channels, paste it, but offset the phase ever so slightly on each subsequent layer. As long as they're all different, you can see the effect we'll get. Okay, that looks good. Maybe a bit too much. So let's turn down some of the rotations, as it looks like they have quite a large impact. Let's turn those down to 0.01 and adjust the scale on a few of them to give a little bit more differentiation. And as a quick playthrough, quite subtle, difficult to see, but I think it looks nice. Just adds that extra layer. And unlike our wiggle bones, we don't have to bake this effect in. And there we have our animation, which we could totally just render out now and call it a day. But after adding a simple environment and doing a little bit of compositing work to soften up that harsh Eevee render, we can make our animation look so much cooler. So let's look at doing that in the next chapter.